The first thing Mara Voss noticed about the Keth was that they did not blink. She had been standing at the edge of the landing pad for 11 minutes, her breath fogging in the November cold, her hand resting on the security rail that separated the welcome delegation from the ship. 11 minutes of watching the forward hatch cycle open, watching the ramp extrude itself from the hull like a pale tongue, watching the Keth delegation descend in their amber environmental suits, and not one of them had blinked. Their eyes were wide, vertical pupilled, the color of old jade, and they moved across the tarmac with a boneless, flowing quality, as if their joints were suggestions rather than hinges. She counted 6 of them. She counted the eyes of all 6. No blinks, not one. It wasn't the strangest thing she'd noticed about them. The strangest thing was the way they looked at the crowd, at the politicians and scientists and media representatives arranged in their careful semicircle with an expression she had no word for. Not contempt, not curiosity. Something between the two, like a naturalist observing an ant colony that had begun constructing something that resembled architecture. She had been watching faces all her professional life, learning to read emotion in the musculature of species that didn't share her evolutionary heritage, and she was good at it. The Keth defeated her. The expression was there, she was certain of that, but she had no key to read it, no corresponding feeling in her own catalog of felt experience to pin it to. She filed it away. She filed everything. Mara was 34 years old and had spent the last 6 years working xenolinguistics for the UN Contact Bureau, which was a department that had been created 3 years before contact with a mixture of optimism, political necessity, and the vague feeling that someone should probably be thinking about this. She was not supposed to be one of the people who talked. She was supposed to stand back, listen, catalog, and report. She was very good at this. She had a gift, which had served her poorly in her personal life and very well in her professional one, for sitting very still in rooms and absorbing everything without appearing to absorb anything. She had cataloged the ambient acoustic emissions of the Keth vessel for 3 days before the hatch opened, filling 17 pages of notation with sound patterns she couldn't yet interpret but could feel mattered. Low, subsonic pulses, irregular but not random. Like breathing, she'd written in her notes. Like something thinking. The lead diplomat, a tall Belgian man named Claes, whose name she always mispronounced internally in a way she found privately embarrassing, stepped forward to offer the prepared greeting. 7 languages, then a mathematical sequence. The Keth were known to respond to prime sequences. It had been in the preliminary contact transmissions, the ones that had come 9 months ago, before anyone was quite ready to admit what was happening. She watched the lead Keth, taller than the others by a full head, the one with the amber suit marked in angular symbols she'd been studying for 3 days, hold perfectly, absolutely still while Clay spoke. The stillness was not patience. She understood that even then, though she didn't have the vocabulary for it yet, patience implies the passage of time being endured. The Keth lead wasn't enduring anything. It was simply not moving, the way a mountain is not moving, not waiting for something to end, but existing in a mode of being that had no particular relationship to duration. Then it answered. The sound that came from the lead Keth was not produced by any visible mouth. It seemed to originate from somewhere within the thorax, a resonant multitonal chord that modulated rapidly in a way that made Mara's teeth ache pleasantly, the way very low bass notes do when they're felt more than heard. She had her recorder running. She had 3 recorders running. She pressed the one in her coat pocket with her thumb as if reassuring it. The UN translator program processed for 4.7 seconds, then rendered. Acknowledged. Your world has been cataloged. We have come to discuss terms. Clay smiled his diplomatic smile. Mara watched his shoulders and did not see them relax. Neither did hers. That was 3 years ago. The terms, as they were eventually explained over the following 6 months of formal sessions, were not unfair, or so the Keth said repeatedly, with the patience of someone explaining a natural law to a child who keeps insisting the law must be mistaken. The Keth Consortium had been cataloging habitable worlds for 400 of their years. Earth was the 43rd world they had found with indigenous sapient life. Of those 43, 38 had accepted terms. 2 had been rendered non-viable through what the Keth called, in the translation program's best approximation, preemptive atmospheric correction. 3 had attempted resistance and been reduced to what the Keth called, again in the translation program's approximation, fallow status. The word fallow sat in Mara's notes with a circle around it and 3 question marks. She spent a week trying to find a more precise translation and eventually concluded that the translation program had it right, and the conclusion was, worse than the approximation, fallow meant left to lie. Fallow meant the potential for future use had not been extinguished, merely paused. The three civilizations that had resisted and been reduced to fallow status were not destroyed. They were waiting. The Keth had not killed them. The Keth had, in a manner of speaking, put them to bed. The consortium's record, the Keth noted without apparent pride, was perfect. The terms were these: Earth would continue to function as Earth. Its people would continue to live, work, reproduce. Its governments, for the most part, would continue to operate. A tithe of resources, minerals, organics, atmospheric gases would be extracted on a schedule the Keth would determine using equipment they would install. A small number of humans, the Keth's calculation suggested 12,000 per generation, would serve in what the translation program called auxiliary functions aboard Keth vessels or at Keth installations throughout the consortium's territory. This, the Keth lead explained at the 7th session of formal negotiations, was not slavery. Slavery implied exploitation for the benefit of the exploiter at the cost of the exploited. This was integration. The humans in auxiliary functions would learn, would observe, would become part of the larger structure of the consortium's ongoing civilization. There were species throughout the consortium who had entered as auxiliary participants and had, over generations, become full members. The word full had a very specific resonance in the Keth's language that the translation program flagged without being able to precisely render. The closest approximation was something between complete and subsumed. Mara sat in the back of that 7th session and wrote in her notebook. They believe this. That's the part that no one is talking about. They genuinely believe this is reasonable. The horror is not their cruelty. They are not being cruel. The horror is their certainty. She underlined certainty twice. She wrote, "Certainty this complete is not arrogance. Arrogance requires the knowledge that you might be wrong. This is something else. This is data. They have 400 years of data, and they have never been wrong. And so the possibility of error has become, for them, a theoretical concept with no practical application." She drew a line under that too. Then she wrote, in smaller letters at the bottom of the page, "How do you argue with something that has never been wrong?" And under that, even smaller, "You don't argue. You become something their data doesn't account for." She didn't know yet what that meant. She thought about it for 18 months before she started to understand. The vote in the UN Security Council was 41-6, with 3 abstentions. The vote in the General Assembly was 172-11. There was rioting in Jakarta and Lagos and Sao Paulo and Manila and Bogota. There were prayer services in Rome and Mecca and Salt Lake City and Jerusalem and Varanasi. There were 15 governments that announced they would not comply with the terms, and 12 of those governments quietly reversed their positions over the following 8 months. As the economic implications became clear, and the Keth Consortium's logistics vessels began arriving in low orbit, 3 did not reverse. Mara watched the Keth render those 3 nations' capitals into glass from the roof of the UN building in Geneva, standing in November cold again, and she wrote nothing in her notebook that night. She tried once, sat with her pen against the paper for 20 minutes, and put it away. There were no words that were accurate enough. She sat on the edge of her bed in her hotel room afterward and looked at the wall for a long time, and she thought about a documentary her father had shown her when she was a child, a film about a time before memory, when the world was all fire and ice and the first stubborn organisms had found a way to exist in the gaps between catastrophes, not by being strong enough to withstand the catastrophe, but by finding the cracks between the heat and the cold where a small thing could survive. She quit the UN Contact Bureau the next morning. She found Rook in the same place she always found him when he was thinking, which was to say not in his office, not in any of the 3 safe houses the network used in rotation, but sitting at a table in a particular corner of a particular cafe in Lyon that served an unremarkable coffee and an excellent tart tatin. The cafe was owned by a woman named Sylvie, who had very good instincts about the kind of people who needed corners with good sight lines, and did not ask questions. The cafe also had a back exit through the kitchen, which both Mara and Rook knew, and which Sylvie probably suspected was relevant. He was looking at a newspaper, an actual newspaper, printed on actual paper, because Rook was old enough to find the habit romantic, and young enough to know it was also practical. Paper did not emit signals. "You saw the vote," she said. "I saw the vote." He set down the newspaper. Henry Rook was 51 years old, built like someone who had once been athletic, and had then spent 20 years sitting in rooms deciding things, with gray at his temples and a scar along his left jaw that he'd had since before she met him, and which she had never asked about. He wore the kind of clothes that were technically ordinary and actually constructed for specific practical purposes, which was a quality Mara had always respected in a person. He had been, before the contact, a colonel in the French Army's Special Operations Command. He was now the closest thing the resistance had to a leader, which meant he spent most of his time arguing with other people who thought they should be the leader, because that was, she had observed, the universal nature of resistance movements. Tremendous courage combined with catastrophic internal politics. "I've been thinking," he said. "You always say that." "I've been thinking specifically." He pushed a thin data chip across the table toward her. She picked it up. It was warm from his fingers. The Keth logistics ships. 3 of them now, in Lagrange 4. They're not fully crewed. "How do you know?" "Because I have a person on the resource extraction team at the Kazakhstan site," and she counted drones. He looked at his coffee. "Keth use a specific drone-to-crew ratio. The numbers are off by a lot. The ships are running lean." "I think they're running lean everywhere. They're spread across 43 worlds. And their population base, based on everything we know about their biology, is not unlimited. They're thin. They've been thin for a while." Mara thought about the Keth she had spent 3 years watching, the way they moved, the absolute stillness when they were processing, the way the lead Keth had looked at the crowd on that November day, not with malice, but with that expression she still had no word for. She thought about the translation program, rendering terms, and integration and fallow status. She thought about certainty so complete it no longer needed to check itself. "You want to take a ship?" she said. "I want to take 3 ships," he said, "but we'll start with one." She sat with that for a moment. Outside the cafe window, Lion was going about its business in the November gray. People walking, traffic moving. A woman arguing pleasantly with a market vendor about the price of something green and leafy. The world continuing to do what the world did. The ordinary hum of it, the weight of it, all the people who had voted the way they voted because they wanted to keep this. The ordinary, unremarkable world, and had made their peace with the terms because the alternative was the glass. She thought, but there's a third thing. She said, "Tell me about Kazakhstan." The plan took 14 months. 14 months during which Mara lived in 4 different cities, on 3 different continents, and slept in 10 different beds, and kept everything she owned in 2 bags that were always half-packed. She became, during those 14 months, a person she would not have recognized 3 years earlier. Someone who had separated herself from almost everything that was not the work. Not through discipline exactly, and not through loss, though there had been loss. Through the gradual understanding that the work was not a thing she was doing in addition to her life. The work was, for now, what her life was. She accepted this the way she had always accepted things that could not be changed, completely, and without ceremony. She studied the Keth's communication protocols as relayed through the extraction site at Kazakhstan, where her source, a Dutch geologist named Petra van Houten, whose poker face was so exceptional that she had at some point crossed from performance into actual temperament, fed her acoustic recordings and electromagnetic readings, and once a fragment of Keth physical notation, angular marks pressed into a surface that was neither paper nor screen, which Mara spent 3 weeks interpreting and which turned out to be something like a shift schedule. A shift schedule was personnel information. Personnel information was vulnerability. She learned that the Keth worked in cycles of roughly 41 hours, not sleeping exactly, but entering a low-state period during which their responsiveness dropped significantly, and their autonomous systems took over. She learned that during these low-state periods, the drones aboard their vessels operated on priority hierarchies that could be predicted if you understood the underlying logic structure. She spent a month on the underlying logic. It was at its core about threat assessment, and the Keth's threat assessment models for humans were calibrated specifically on the data from the 38 worlds that had accepted terms, and the 2 that had been rendered non-viable, and the 3 that had been reduced to fallow status. None of those responses had included what Mara was planning, because none of those civilizations had thought to look like what they had become while preparing to do something else entirely. She wrote in her notebook, "They have not updated their models. They have not felt the need. When you have a perfect record, you stop auditing it." She wrote, "The crack between the heat and the cold." She thought about Tumac. It was an old story from an old film she'd watched with her father when she was 8 years old. A Hammer film, glorious and completely scientifically absurd, with monsters that were men in rubber suits and beauty that was entirely real, and landscapes that had been filmed in the Canary Islands in conditions that were apparently miserable and looked like the beginning of the world. She could remember sitting cross-legged on the living room floor in their house in Stuttgart, her father on the couch behind her, his hand occasionally resting on her shoulder when the monsters appeared, which was a gesture she had not fully appreciated at the time and had thought about constantly since. The hero of the film was a man named Tumak, exiled from his tribe, alone in a vast hostile world, full of creatures that had no particular awareness of his existence and were simply enormous and hungry and present. The thing about Tumak that she had carried all her life, stored in some archival chamber of her memory, along with her father's cologne and the texture of that living room carpet and the particular quality of Saturday afternoon light through their windows, was not the moment when he defeated anything. It was the moment before. Standing on a beach, at the end of his endurance, the world having shown him its full indifference, and a wave coming, and instead of running from it, he just stood there and let it break over him, not giving up, not performing bravery, just absorbing what the world sent and staying on his feet, she thought. The Keth have catalogued a world that stands on beaches. They have not catalogued what we do when the wave comes. The extraction site at Kazakhstan was a wound in the earth 3 kilometers wide and expanding. The Keth had brought their own equipment, articulated mining arrays that moved with that same boneless fluency as the Keth themselves, their operations supervised by a rotating team of 12 Keth and several hundred autonomous drones. The human workforce was present at the Keth's specific request, which had seemed puzzling until Mara worked through the reasoning. The Keth, despite their vast systematic intelligence, had genuine difficulty with what she had come to think of as emergent chaotic problem-solving. Complexity they handled beautifully, but situations that arose from the unpredictable intersection of too many small variables. A cave-in in a particular geological formation, a water intrusion from an unexpected aquifer, the failure of equipment in a sequence that didn't match the failure models, these produced in the Keth something she could only describe as a kind of cognitive dissonance. They would freeze, not for long, but for a moment, a visible moment, the thorax would oscillate, and the jade eyes would dilate, and there would be a half second of absolute processing stillness. Half a second, nothing, unless you had built a plan around it. Mara arrived at the Kazakhstan site 3 weeks before the operation, embedded as a UN compliance observer, a role that still technically existed because the Keth had accepted the UN's request to maintain oversight, presence as a gesture of what they called, in the translation program's approximation, mutual transparency. They had agreed to this because they found it harmless, because they had always found human oversight requests harmless, because the records of 43 worlds told them that human oversight was a form of reassurance that made the integration process smoother and created no actual risk. The idea that an oversight observer might be doing something other than observing had not entered their models. She had 4 bags. One contained clothing and field equipment. One contained surveillance gear so miniaturized it looked like personal effects. One contained the components of a device that Rook's engineers had spent 9 months building, calibrated to the specific electromagnetic signatures of the Keth drone communication protocols. The 4th contained, among other things, a battered notebook, a tin of tart tatin that Sylvie had pressed into her hands at the cafe door without saying anything, and a photograph of her father, which she did not look at every day, but which she needed to have with her. She sat in the observation trailer on the first evening at the site, watching the mining arrays move in the long gold light, and she opened her notebook and wrote, "The first wave always looks impossible. You absorb it and stay standing." She drew a circle around it. She did not cross it out. The Keth compound at the extraction site was built on a design that Mara had spent 9 months studying from architectural notations, concentric rings of function, with the crew quarters at the center, engineering at the second ring, operations at the third, and the drone bays at the outermost ring. It was elegant and efficient, and completely optimized against external threats. The perimeter assumed attack would come from outside, from beyond the drone bays, from a direction that could be monitored. It was, in the history of every fortification ever built by every species that had ever built one, the most natural assumption. The danger is out there. The Keth had never had to consider that the danger might be inside. Eating their food replications and wearing their compliance observer lanyards, because the inside of the perimeter was where the cooperative humans lived, and the cooperative humans were there because their world had signed the terms. Mara worked for 3 weeks doing compliance observations. She was thorough and professional and spoke to the Keth handlers with the precise vocabulary she had spent 3 years building. Not aggressive, not subservient, but the particular quality of presence she had identified in the Keth's own behavioral records as associated with legitimacy. She walked the outer ring on a regular schedule. She cataloged the drone patrol patterns, 11 distinct routes, 4-minute cycles, 2-minute overlaps, a 40-second gap between Route 7's terminus and Route 3's origin point at the northeast corner of the engineering ring, entrance that only existed when the site's internal temperature regulation cycled through its daily reset. 40 seconds. She mapped it twice to be sure, then mapped it again. She ate her meals in the human worker canteen and listened to Petra and the other members of the network, disguised as ordinary site workers, geologists and engineers and logistics staff, talk about their families, about football results, about the strange food the Keth replication systems produced when they attempted human cuisine. The food, according to the site workers, was technically nutritious and tasted, in the words of a Finnish explosives technician named Hari, like something that had been told about flavor secondhand. She activated the device on the 15th day of her third week, at 23:47 local time, 3 minutes after the primary drone patrol completed its synchronized cycle and the secondary autonomous systems began their handoff protocol. The device broadcast a specific modulation pattern into the drone communication channels, not a disruption, not a shutdown, because either of those would have triggered alerts, but a reclassification signal that the drones interpreted as a status update from higher priority source nodes, the engineering ring, sections 4 through 9, reclassified from active monitored to passive logged. The difference was precise. Active monitored meant drones were watching and flagging. Passive logged meant recording without flagging, without alerting, without escalation. The primary Keth crew was in low state. It was 0300 at local time. Mara walked out of the human quarters with 8 people she trusted and moved into the engineering ring. The engineering ring smelled like something between ozone and overripe stone fruit. The Keth lit their interiors at a frequency slightly outside human optimal range, bright enough to navigate by, dim enough to make everything look like it was happening under amber water. Mara had been in Keth structures before, during the contact period, and she had learned to let her eyes adjust rather than fight the quality of the light. She moved the way she had spent a month teaching herself to move, not slowly, which read as hesitant to the still active outer drone systems, but not quickly either, which read as purposeful and would trigger a classification query. She moved at the pace of someone who belongs here, and she had spent 14 months making sure she knew exactly what that looked like. The 8 people with her, Petra, who had not flinched once in 3 years and was not starting now, Hari, who moved with the careful precision of someone who worked professionally with things that could kill him. 3 network members she had trained personally over the past 6 months in Keth structure movement and drone system behavior. 2 people she had never met until 3 days ago, sent by separate cells, vouched for by Rook, who had a gift for knowing which people had the specific quality required for moments like this. Not bravery, not exactly, but something adjacent to bravery, something more durable, which was the capacity to act clearly while afraid. And Daejung. Kim Daejung was 22 years old and had been, before the contact, a third-year electronics student at Seoul National University. He was now, by circumstance and application, and the specific stubbornness that comes from having been told a thing, cannot be done often enough that you stop listening to the people saying it. One of 4 humans on the planet who understood the Keth's quantum state communication architecture well enough to do something useful to it. He was slight and wore his hair in a way that made him look younger than 22, and he carried his equipment bag with the careful deliberateness of someone who knows exactly what is in it and exactly what it will be asked to do. He stood in front of the uplink arrays for the first time, and Mara watched his face do what everyone's face did when they encountered the reality of something they'd been planning for, the moment of reckoning between the concept and the actual thing. The uplink arrays were enormous, floor to ceiling, dense with conduit and resonance chambers that pulsed with a slow, deep amber light like a second heartbeat. The scale of it pressed down on you. The scale of what it connected to pressed down on you even harder if you let yourself think about it, which Mara had learned not to do in the engineering ring and would permit herself to do later when there was time. "You okay?" she said quietly. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the arrays the way his grandfather must have looked at the mine entrance. Then he reached into his kit, pulled out a modified circuit probe, and said, "When I was 8 years old, my grandfather took me to see where he used to work, a coal mine in Gangwon province. He showed me the entrance shaft and told me it went 300 meters down and looked like another world down there. I asked him if he was afraid the first time he went in. He crouched at the base of the array. He said he was afraid every time, not just the first time, every single time for 30 years. And he said, 'You go anyway. Because the coal doesn't come up on its own, and people need heat. And being afraid is a thing you feel, not a thing you are. Mara looked at him. Okay, he said and began. It took 41 minutes. Dae-jung worked with the deliberate, unhurried speed of someone who had rehearsed the sequence 800 times in simulation, and was now in the process of discovering how much the simulation had gotten wrong. The answer was, some things. The access architecture at the tertiary node was configured differently than the blueprints. Indicated, not dramatically different, but enough to require 3 minutes of remapping, crouching close to the base of the array with a probe, and his face very close to the surface. Reading the configuration the way you read a text in a language you know well enough to puzzle through, but not well enough to read quickly. 2 resonance chambers were locked behind an authentication layer that wasn't in the intelligence. He stared at it for a moment. Then he adapted. The conduit routing in the 3rd subarray took a different path than the simulation had shown, which meant his access sequence had to be reordered, which meant 6 minutes of mental restructuring while his hands kept working. He adapted every time. Every dead end, every wrong turn, half a second of stillness, and then he adapted. Mara stood behind him and watched the amber light pulse and listened to her own heartbeat and thought about the wave on the beach, and Tumek standing in it and her father's hand on her shoulder, and the smell of that Saturday afternoon in Stuttgart. She thought about the expression on the Keth Leeds face from 3 years ago, and she turned it over again in the amber light, looking for the word, and still couldn't find it. She thought, you are about to encounter a thing that will help you find it. At 37 minutes, there was a sound from the direction of the crew quarters. Her radio clicked twice, the signal from the team members stationed at the quarters perimeter. Movement, 1 Keth, not in low state, moving toward engineering. She looked at Dae-jung. His hand stopped for half a second. He looked at her. 4 minutes, he said. Maybe 3.5. The Keth would reach them in 90 seconds, maybe slightly more. She made the decision the way she had made every decision in the last 14 months, not by weighing it because there was no time to weigh it, but by accepting what was in front of her and moving with it. She crossed the engineering ring, passed through the amber corridor, and walked toward the approaching Keth. She saw it before it saw her, smaller than the handlers, one of the engineering crew by the marking patterns on its suit. It was carrying something, a tool or component, held in a grip that was not quite a hand but functioned as one. It stopped when it became aware of her, 3 meters away. Its jade eyes dilated. The thoracic oscillation began. Half a second of absolute stillness. She spoke. She spoke in the Keth's own language, and she was not good at it. She would not have described herself as good at it under any circumstances. The phonemic structure was largely supra-auditory for human vocal cords, requiring specific laryngeal adjustments she had spent 4 months training herself to produce, and even at her best, she knew her pronunciation was approximate at best, and wrong in ways she couldn't fully hear at worst. But she had the shift schedule notation and 3 years of communication logs and the specific vocabulary she needed, and she spoke for approximately 30 seconds, modulating the way she had practiced, maintaining the particular resonance quality that the Keth associated with authorization. And what she said was something close to maintenance authorization, compliance observation unit, upper engineering review, standard protocol. She held the Keth's gaze while she said it. She held it with the specific quality that she had come to understand the Keth associated with legitimacy. Not confidence, not aggression, but the absolute settled calm of someone who is exactly where they should be and has no relationship to the possibility that this might be questioned. She had practiced this quality in mirrors, and she had practiced it in conversations, and she had practiced it in moments of actual danger over the preceding months, and it was not a performance anymore. It was a thing she had built into her body, the way Dae-jung had built the sequence into his hands. The Keth looked at her for what felt like a long time and was probably 6 seconds. Its thorax oscillated once more. Its jade eyes were fixed on her, and she held that gaze and did not look away and did not blink and did not let her face do anything except be exactly what she needed it to be. The Keth made a sound she had catalogued in her recordings as acknowledgement and epistle. It turned. It walked back toward the crew quarters. She stood in the corridor until she could no longer hear it. She stood with her heart hammering against her ribs like a fist on a door. She breathed. She breathed once more. Then she walked back to the uplink array and crouched beside Dae-jung. "How are we doing?" she said. Her voice was almost ordinary. She was proud of her voice. He was sitting back on his heels, looking at the array with the expression of someone who has just run a very long distance and has not yet processed the fact that they've arrived. "Done," he said. "We're done." The 3 logistics ships in Lagrange 4 went deaf 7 minutes later. The uplink termination signal propagated through the quantum state architecture and reached the ships as a communication blackout that their systems initially interpreted as a localized disruption, an interpretation the ships spent 17 seconds attempting to correct before reclassifying the event as systemic. During those 17 seconds, the ship's automated defense systems received no clearance updates. Without clearance updates, the defense system's threat assessment hierarchy defaulted to a secondary protocol that had not been written for this specific situation and was therefore producing conflicting priority outputs, a processing conflict that the autonomous systems responded to by requesting resolution from the crewed command stations. The crewed command stations were occupied by Keth in low state. The 12 converted cargo aircraft out of Aktobi crossed into Keth-defended airspace during that window. They were not warplanes. They had never been warplanes. They were repurposed civilian and commercial aircraft, modified over the previous 4 months by a team of engineers who had worked in a repurposed warehouse outside the city with the focused desperation of people who understand that perfection is unavailable and excellent will have to do. The pilots were volunteers, military, civilian, some with combat experience, some with none, all of them having spent 5 months training for this specific approach vector, this specific window, this specific sequence of events, with the full understanding of what the odds were and the equally full understanding that they were going anyway. 3 of the 12 did not make it through the defense perimeter. Mara learned that number later, and she sat with it, and she carried it from that day forward, not as guilt, because she had offered what information she had, and everyone involved had made their own choice with their own eyes open, but as weight. Weight is different from guilt. Guilt is about fault. Weight is about what is owed. 9 made it through. Rook was on the second aircraft to breach the hull of the largest logistics ship, which Mara also learned later, and which caused her to say things to him that she had never said to anyone professionally, which he received with the patience of a man who had known she would have this reaction and had gone anyway, because being afraid was a thing you felt, not a thing you were. The interior of a Keth logistics ship was vast and dim and smelled like stone fruit and ozone and something else she had no reference for, a third smell underneath the first 2 that was neither organic nor mechanical, as if the ship itself had an atmosphere that was slightly more alive than it should be. The corridors were designed for Keth dimensions, wider than a human corridor by a factor of about 1.5, lower ceilings than expected, with walls that curved in organic arcs that made directionality confusing in a way that was hard to articulate. The amber lighting was the same quality as the extraction site, and it gave everything the feeling of being slightly underwater, slightly untethered from normal spatial logic. Rook moved through it with 34 people who had been living inside the ship's schematic for 6 months. They had walked the corridors in simulation so many times they could navigate by the floor textures and the smell of the ventilation, gradients, and the subtle pressure changes at corridor junctions. The Keth aboard were no longer in low state. The hull breach had ended that, and they were moving through their own ship with the thorough, systematic knowledge of beings who had designed and inhabited every section of it. Thorough knowledge is different from the survivor's map. Rook had called it this in a briefing, and Mara had added a note to her notebook. The survivor's map is built from need, not description. It contains things no specification document records, every gap, every ambiguity, every alternative route that exists because the primary route was unavailable during a period of study. The survivor's map has redundancy built into it because the person making it understood that the primary route might not exist when needed. The Keth's map of their own ship was built by engineers in a specification document. It was thorough and accurate and complete for all normal operational purposes. It did not contain the 40-second gap between drone routes 7 and 3 in the Northeast Junction. It did not contain the reclassification architecture that made a human look like a maintenance protocol. It did not contain the specific human capacity to build a map of something hostile from outside it, by necessity, from desperation, with the specific thoroughness that only comes from knowing you will get one chance. Rook reached the command nexus in 11 minutes. 2 members of his team were injured getting there, injuries that were serious and treated later, and from which both people recovered, something else Mara learned later and noted in her notebook under the heading, Weight, Not Guilt. The command nexus was a broad, low chamber at the ship's geometric center, dense, with resonance architecture identical to the uplink arrays at the extraction site, currently staffed by 6 Keth, who had reached it ahead of Rook, and were in the process of attempting to restore communication with the uplink array network that was no longer answering. They were in the state she had studied and cataloged for 3 years. Thoracic oscillation, dilated jade eyes, the half-second of absolute processing stillness in which a model that has never encountered this input attempts to categorize it. Rook moved through the half-second. The command nexus fell at 0347 local Kazakhstan time. Mara heard about it through a static-cracked radio at 0351 while she was still in the engineering ring of the extraction site, sitting on the floor with her back against the base of the uplink array and the amber light pulsing above her and her notebook in her hands. She had been sitting there since Daejung said done. She had not been able to move, not because of injury or fear, but because her body seemed to need a moment to exist without doing anything, which was a need she had not given it in 14 months, and which she could spare for approximately 3 minutes before the next phase of the operation required her. She sat in the amber light and thought about the people she would never meet on the 3 aircraft that hadn't made it. She thought about what their last 90 seconds had been. She hoped it had been fast. She thought about the particular courage that looks like nothing because it asks no audience. The courage of continuing to drive an aircraft toward a target when you know the defense systems are tracking you and the window is closing and there is no backup and no second chance. And the only thing that changes anything is you and the aircraft in the next 30 seconds. She thought, this is what we are. This is the thing their catalog does not contain, she thought. Not the victory, not the power, this. She thought about the Keth led on the day of contact, standing on the tarmac in the November cold, looking at the crowd of humans with that expression she had carried for 3 years without a word to put it in. She turned it over again in the amber light. She still couldn't find it. She thought, soon. She stood up. She put the notebook in her bag. She went to find the others. The Keth's response was not immediate. This surprised people who had not been watching them closely. It did not surprise Mara. The Keth did not react. They assessed. They were not built for speed in the face of the unexpected. They were built for thoroughness, and thoroughness required time. And time was what they had always had in abundance, because no civilization in 400 years had given them reason to hurry. The assessment of what had happened at the Kazakhstan site and aboard the logistics ship. A successful, coordinated action by the indigenous population of a compliant world against a consortium installation took 9 days. 9 days of silence from the ships in Lagrange 4, now crewed by a shifting rotation of the network's people who were learning the ship's systems with the same obsessive necessity that had produced the survivor's map of its corridors. 9 days during which the Keth on Earth maintained their extraction operations but did not escalate, did not retaliate against the human workforce, did not glass anything they processed. Mara was back in Lion when the formal communication arrived. She was in Rook's corner of the cafe, which was now also her corner, with a coffee she had barely touched and a tart tatin she was eating slowly because she had not eaten properly in 3 days. And Sylvie had put it in front of her with the expression of someone who is not asking questions, but is making a statement. The transmission came through the encrypted relay at 0940 local time. The translation program rendered it in under 3 seconds, which was faster than it had ever rendered Keth communication, and she understood that this speed meant the message was simple. Not simple in complexity, but simple in structure. Stripped of the layered qualifications and contextual framing that Keth formal communications usually carried, the Keth said, we acknowledge an anomalous event. We will reassess operational parameters. We request formal communication through established protocols. She set down her coffee. She read it again. She took out her notebook and wrote, they said anomalous, not hostile, not offensive, not resistance, anomalous. Something that does not fit the existing model. They are not angry. They are confused. And for the first time in 400 years, confusion is a thing they need to address. She drew a box around that last sentence. Then she wrote, this is the crack between the heat and the cold. The response through formal channels was Mara's. Not because she had been chosen through any formal process. The network's governance was, as always, a diplomatic catastrophe that Rook managed through a combination of patience, firmness, and the willingness to occasionally walk out of meetings at exactly the right moment. But because she was the one who had 3 years of Keth, communication in her body, and because she had stood in front of a Keth in an amber corridor and not flinched, and because she was the person who had written the phrase the 4th category in her notebook 18 months ago, before she knew how to enact it, and had spent 18 months figuring out what enacting it would require. The formal communication session was held on neutral ground. Getting the Keth to agree to neutral ground was itself a small victory that had taken 4 days of back and forth through the standard protocol channels, the Keth initially proposing one of their own vessels, then the Kazakhstan site's administrative complex, both of which were declined by the network, which then proposed a decommissioned communications satellite in low orbit that belonged to no nation and no institution. The Keth processed this for 36 hours and agreed. The session was conducted via encrypted relay. Mara sat at a desk in a basement in Geneva in a building that was not the UN and spoke in a combination of translated text and phonemic Keth, and the lead Keth. She had always believed it was the same one from the tarmac 3 years ago, though she had never found a way to confirm this, was present on screen, jade eyes fixed on the camera with that absolute, unblinking quality. She said, "We are not the 38. We are not the 3. She said, "We are a fourth category that your models do not contain." She said, "You have cataloged our world. You have not cataloged our nature." There was a long pause. The Keth-led's thorax oscillated. The jade eyes widened fractionally. Half a second of stillness. Then explain. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for this for 6 months, knowing this moment would come if the operation succeeded, knowing that this moment was perhaps more important than the operation itself, because taking a ship was a demonstration. What she said here was the argument for what the demonstration meant. She said, "We are organisms shaped by catastrophe. Our world has attempted to end us more times than your records contain. Ice that covered everything, fire from the sky, diseases that moved through our populations like weather, ourselves, which has been the most consistent catastrophe of all. We have not survived by being the strongest species on our world because we are not. We have not survived by being the fastest or the most physically capable because we are not those things either." She paused. She said, "We have survived by adapting to the thing that is trying to kill us. This is not the same as accepting it. When your terms arrived, most of our world accepted them. This was accurate. This was also not complete information about what our world was doing." Another pause. She let it sit, she said. "Acceptance can be a posture while adaptation continues. Your models do not contain this because no world in your record has done this. We are not performing for you. We are telling you what we are. We are asking you to revise your catalog." The Keth was still for a very long time. Then, "This communication contains elements that require extended assessment." She said, "We are aware. We will wait." And she did. She sat in the basement in Geneva and she waited. And for the first time in 3 years, she was not afraid of the waiting. The Keth deliberated for 11 days. Mara spent those 11 days in a way that surprised her. Not in frenetic preparation, not in the obsessive review of recordings and notations, but in a state that she could only describe as held breath. The work had been done. The arguments had been made. The demonstration had been made. What happened now was outside her hands, and she had spent enough time in the last 3 years doing what was outside her hands to have developed, if not peace with this, at least a functional relationship with it. She slept in the basement in Geneva, on a cot that was too short for her by several centimeters, and which she had solved by tucking her feet under a folded blanket at the end. She ate what the kitchen produced, which was variable and sometimes surprisingly good. She reviewed her notations not obsessively but slowly, the way you reread a letter you've already read many times, not looking for new information but thinking about what you already know. She called her mother in Stuttgart on the 5th day. Her mother cried as she always did, and Mara stayed on the line and did not try to stop her, which was something she had learned in the last 3 years, that some crying is not a problem to be solved, but a thing to be witnessed. Petra arrived from Kazakhstan on the 7th day, evacuated when it became clear the Keth might retaliate against the site's human population. She was thinner and more tired than Mara had seen her, and she sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a cup of tea and looked at them for a long moment. "My husband wants me to come home," she said. Mara waited. "He says I've done enough. He's not wrong." Petra looked up. "He's just also not right." From across the kitchen, where he was studying a printed map of orbital mechanics that he had been studying for 3 days, Rook said without looking up, "I had a dog once, shepherd mix, when I was young. No particular sense. She used to stand in the river in summer, just stand there in the middle of the current, and look entirely pleased with herself. Took me 20 years to understand what she was doing." Petra looked at him, then at Mara. Mara thought, "We have no shared language for what he just said, but we both understood it exactly, and that understanding is itself the thing." On the 11th day, the Keth responded. The lead Keth's communication was the longest single transmission in the 3 years of contact, and the translation program took 42 seconds to render it. Mara sat very still for those 42 seconds with her hands flat on the table, her recorder running, her notebook open. The translation read, "Your proposal represents an unprecedented category in consortium contact records. We have reviewed your resistance actions in full detail. We have reviewed your communication. We find that our operational models for indigenous response contain insufficient data for the category of response your world has demonstrated. We further acknowledge that the gap in our models is not the result of inadequate data collection, but of inadequate category formation. Our models contain two categories of indigenous response: acceptance and resistance. Your world has demonstrated that these are not the only categories available. We had not considered the possibility of a third category. This represents a significant recalibration requirement for consortium contact protocols. We are prepared to discuss revised terms." She read it 3 times. She read it a 4th time slowly, looking at individual words. She thought about insufficient. She thought about what it cost a civilization that had been sufficient for 400 years to record that word in an official document. She thought about significant recalibration requirement and heard, underneath the formal bureaucratic architecture of it, something that she had not expected to hear and had not allowed herself to anticipate. She heard, "We were wrong." She wrote, in their language, "Insufficiency of data is not failure. It is a condition, like temperature, like pressure, something that must be corrected. They do not experience it as shame, but they experience it as real. And real is enough." She wrote first contact. Real first contact. The revised terms took 8 months. They were difficult months, not because the Keth were hostile. The Keth had shifted into a mode of genuine inquiry that Mara found both easier and harder to navigate than the original term sessions. Easier because they were listening, harder because what they were listening for was precision, and she was required to produce precision in a language she spoke imperfectly about, concepts she was in the process of inventing, but because nothing in the territory they were mapping existed in any prior map. They were building something new. Building something new takes longer than implementing something that already exists, and the time is not wasted. The resource extraction schedule was restructured as co-determined, with human environmental bodies having formal standing to request review. The auxiliary service program became a voluntary exchange with reciprocal obligations on both sides. Mara negotiated for 3 provisions that the Keth found genuinely puzzling and accepted after extended deliberation: the right of humans to decline participation without penalty, the right to formal petition for schedule revision, and the provision she had spent the most time on, which in the final text read, the right to remain anomalous. 2 full sessions were spent on that phrase, she explained. The right of a people to continue to produce outcomes that require new models to describe. The right to be something the existing frameworks did not anticipate, the lead Keth said. This describes a condition. We do not understand how a conditions can be granted as a right, she said. Most things that matter are not granted. They are present, and then they are documented. You are being asked to document this one. The lead Keth was still. The thorax oscillated slowly, in the pattern she had come to associate with deep processing. Not surface uncertainty, but the kind of processing that happens when a model is genuinely being revised rather than just updated. The lead said, "This is difficult to incorporate." She said, "We know. We are asking you to build the framework that can contain it. We believe you are capable of this." There was a very long pause. The lead Keth said, "Why?" She thought about that question. She thought about the tarmac 3 years ago, and the expression she'd never had a word for. She said, "Because you are asking." Only something capable of building a new framework asks, why rather than refusing. The lead Keth was still again. And then, in the amber light of the encrypted relay, with jade eyes fixed on the camera and not blinking, the expression appeared again. The one from the tarmac. The one she had carried for 3 years without a word for it. She looked at it. She held it in her attention the way you hold a key you've found beside a lock, turning it over, finding the angles. She found the word. She found it the way things come when you've been looking so long that you stop trying. It was wonder. The Keth was in wonder at a thing it could not yet fully understand. Not contempt, not curiosity. The thing that lives between them and is older than both. The experience of encountering something that exceeds the existing map. She thought, "There you are," she thought. "There we both are." The formal agreement was enacted on a Thursday morning in late March. The Keth's binding acknowledgement resonance was transmitted at 10:23. The human parties signed on paper, with pens, because Rook had insisted on this, and no one had argued because some things should be done with the hands. Mara signed last. She held the pen for a moment. She looked at the paper, at the names already on it, at the document's imperfect but real language, at the 3 specific provisions she had built into it, through 8 months of precision and patience, and she thought about weight and what is owed. She thought about Aktobi and 3 crews. She thought about Daejung's grandfather in the mine for 30 years, afraid every time, going anyway. She thought about her father's hand on her shoulder and the Saturday afternoon light and Tumak standing in the wave. She signed. 6 months later, back in the actual Geneva, in a proper conference room with appropriate lighting and a view of the November Lake, the lead Keth said, at the end of an administrative session that had been almost ordinary, "We have updated our catalog entry for your world. Your designation has been revised from pending integration to anomalous, active study." She asked, "What does active study mean in consortium records?" The Keth said, "It means we do not yet have a framework adequate to describe you. It means the record is open and ongoing. It means you are something we are still learning how to see," she asked. How many worlds carry that designation? A pause. 1. She sat with that. The session ended. The screen went dark. She sat in the conference room with the November light coming through the glass, and she thought about 43 worlds in the Keth Consortium's catalog. She thought about a record that had been perfect, and was now something more interesting than perfect. She thought about the expression on a face that had no eyes that blinked, and the word she had finally found for it, and what it meant that a species from 400 years away, and a world she had only seen through a relay screen, could look at something with the same feeling she'd had sitting on a living room floor at the age of 8, watching a film with her father, watching a man stand in a wave and not fall down. She took out her notebook. Clean page. She wrote, "There are 43 worlds in the Keth Consortium's catalog. 38 accepted, 2 destroyed, 3 reduced to fallow. 1 is something else. 1 has the only open record. 1 is still being learned." She looked at it. She wrote good. She put the notebook away. She walked out into the November cold. The lake was gray and wide and moving. Rook found her at the lake. "He had a gift for this. How'd it go?" He said. "They updated our entry. To what? Anomalous. Active study. Only 1. She looked at the water. Daejung said yes to the exchange program before they finished asking. Of course he did. Rook was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to say at the orientation?" She watched the lake. "My father told me once, the thing about a wave is, it doesn't care about you at all. It's not trying to knock you down or help you stand. It's doing what it does. And what happens to you in it is entirely up to you." She paused. "That's what I'm going to say." Rook looked at the water. A bird landed on the railing beside them and regarded them with the absolute unimpressed intelligence of something that has coexisted with humans for 10,000 years and found them tolerable. "Your father sounds like he was a good man," Rook said. "He was." They stood for a while. The lake moved. Above them, somewhere past the gray, a ship was learning how to see something it had never seen before, and somewhere in Aktobi a memorial was being built, and somewhere in Seoul a young engineer was reading a briefing about what it would feel like to walk through amber corridors under a light that wasn't quite right with a species that was still building the framework to understand him. He would go afraid. He would go anyway. "The coal does not come up on its own." "Come on," she said. "I'll buy you a coffee." "The cafe is 2 kilometers. Yes." They walked. The city was alive around them, full of the ordinary, unremarkable hum of a world that was still here, still moving, still doing what it did, which was the most specific and irreducible thing about it, she thought. The world did not have a gift for grand gestures. It had a gift for continuing. It had a gift for being, stubbornly and without ceremony, exactly what it was, in the face of everything that had ever tried to make it something else. She walked. The lake was behind her now. The city was ahead. 43 worlds in the catalog. 1 open record. Enough. More than enough. Exactly enough. She walked. 3 months before the formal agreement was enacted. In the deep of a January that felt like the world holding its breath, Mara sat in on a session she had not been scheduled for. It was not a negotiation session. It was a working group, one of 12 that had formed after the 11th day communication, composed of Keth technical observers and human subject specialists, assigned to map the specific gaps in the consortium's contact models that the 4th category had exposed. The working group Mara sat in on was focused on what the Keth's records called the adaptation coefficient, a metric the consortium used to predict how quickly an indigenous population would stabilize after integration, meaning how quickly they would stop producing variability and settle into predictable behavior within the consortium's administrative structure. Every world in the record had an adaptation coefficient. Most were between 0.7 and 0.9, meaning the population adapted to integration at between 70 and 90% of the expected rate, which the Keth found entirely satisfactory. Two worlds had coefficients above 1.0. They adapted faster than expected, which the consortium's records noted with mild approval. The working group was trying to calculate a coefficient for humanity. There were 3 Keth in the room, and 7 humans, including 2 sociologists, a behavioral ecologist, and a historian who had retired 20 years ago from a career studying civilizational collapse and had come back to work because the circumstances warranted it. The Keth technical observer running the session, a slim being with paler-than-average amber markings that Mara associated, from her study of the angular notation, with a senior research designation, was presenting a series of models on a display that projected from the table's surface in the Keth's preferred light frequency, which made everything look like it was happening in an amber fog. The models were not working. The difficulty, said the historian, whose name was Dr. Karamov, and who had a white beard and the gentle ferocity of a man who has been right about several important things for a long time without being listened to, is that you're looking for a coefficient that measures adaptation as a direction. Adaptation towards something. Towards stability. The Keth observer made a sound. The translation in Mara's earpiece rendered it as, correct. This is the standard model, yes. But we don't adapt towards stability, said Dr. Karamov. We adapt toward problem solving. Those are different target states. Stability for us is a rest state between problems. We don't move toward it. We fall into it temporarily and move out again. The Keth observer was still for a moment. Then elaborate. We thrive under pressure, said the behavioral ecologist, a young Indian woman named Dr. Nair, who had spent the previous 2 years studying Keth-human interaction dynamics at the Kazakhstan site and had views about them that she expressed with the directness of someone who has stopped softening things because softening them was taking too long. Not all of us, and not all the time, but as a species, and specifically as a species operating under existential threat, we produce our most adaptive and innovative behavior under conditions of high stress and constraint. Your models assume that stress and constraint reduce adaptive capacity. For many species, this is probably accurate. For us, it frequently increases it. Explain the mechanism. Fear, said Dr. Nair, it's primarily fear. Fear is cognitively expensive for us. It consumes metabolic resources, it narrows attention, it produces physiological responses that interfere with fine motor control and long-term planning. We are not well designed for fear as a chronic state, but in acute doses in response to specific threats, it activates a mode of problem solving that is extraordinary in scope and intensity. We call it survival mode, though that's a reductive name for it. She paused. The 3 years between your arrival and the operation at Kazakhstan, she said, were 3 years during which a significant portion of the human population was operating in low-grade chronic fear. This is not a state that produces our best work. The 6 months leading up to the operation, when a small population of humans had converted fear into a specific task, produced some of the most sophisticated adaptive engineering our species has accomplished in the last 100 years. Not because those people were special, because they had a problem to solve and understood that the alternative to solving it was intolerable. The Keth observer was very still. Mara wrote in her notebook, sitting in the back of the room, "They are trying to calculate us. They will not be able to. Not because we are incalculable, we are not in the aggregate over time, but because the calculation requires a framework they have not yet built. The coefficient they are looking for does not exist because the thing they are trying to measure is not a rate. It is a quality. It is what happens when the wave comes and you choose to stand in it." She underlined, "when you choose." The Keth observer concluded the session by requesting additional data inputs and scheduling a follow-up working group in 3 weeks. As the room cleared, it paused beside Mara in the doorway, looking at her with jade eyes that did not blink. It said, in phonemic Keth, not through the relay, directly at a volume intended for her alone, a sequence of sounds she had cataloged previously, and knew. It was a phrase from the shift schedule notation, which had not been designed as a phrase at all, but which in context meant something she translated after a moment as, "I revise my records regarding this entry." She thought about that. Then she said in her imperfect phonemic Keth, the record was never finished. It was always being written. The Keth observer was still. Then it moved on. She stood in the doorway for a moment and thought about what it meant that a being from a civilization 400 years old and 43 worlds, White had just told her, in the language of a shift schedule, that it was reconsidering its notes. She wrote, "This is how it starts. Not with victory, with revision." On the night before she signed the formal agreement, Mara could not sleep. This was not unusual. She had not slept particularly well in 3 years, but it was a different quality of wakefulness than she was accustomed to. Usually she lay awake because her mind was working, grinding through problems and contingencies and language sequences. That night she lay awake because her mind was quiet, and the quiet felt unfamiliar in a way she wasn't sure how to inhabit. She got up at 0230 and went to the small kitchen attached to the safe house, where the network's Geneva contingent had been living for the past month. She made tea. She stood at the window with her tea and looked at the city, the pre-dawn stillness of it, the empty streets with their amber streetlights. Amber light again, she thought. I am going to spend the rest of my life seeing amber light differently. And she thought about the word rest, the rest of my life. It had acquired a new weight somewhere in the last 3 years, that phrase. Before, it had been a vague temporal expanse, a placeholder for the future in the abstract. Now it meant the time that follows this, the time that exists because this happened and you are standing at the far end of it. She thought about the people who didn't make it to the far end of it. She thought about Harry, the Finnish explosives technician, who had spent 6 months of her operation, and then 3 months of negotiation period, and then one morning in November, received a phone call from Helsinki, and had left without explanation and come back 3 days later with red eyes and a new quality of quiet. She had asked him once carefully if he was all right. He had said, "My brother thinks I'm on a geology project. He always thought I should have been a geologist. He wanted me to come home." He had paused, I told him, soon. And he had gone back to work with the specific focused energy of a person who has put something in a box and closed the lid, not permanently, but for now, she thought. We are full of things we have put in boxes for now. This is not a flaw. This is how you carry what needs to be carried when you cannot set it down yet. She thought about the exchange program beginning in 3 weeks. 22 humans going up. 22 Keth coming down. The first crossing that was not conquest, not compliance, not performance, but the uncertain, cautious, good faith beginning of something that had no name yet in either language. She thought about Daejung, who would be one of the 22 going up, and who had spent the 3 months since the operation studying Keth language with the same focused obsession he had brought to the communication architecture, staying up late in whatever room was available, filling notebooks with phonemic transcriptions and grammatical analyses, occasionally surfacing from this work with the expression of someone who has been very far away and is slightly surprised to find themselves back. She had asked him once what he was finding, and he had said, their language has no future tense, not in the way ours does. They describe the future as a region of high probability extending from the present state. It's not a direction, it's a cloud of possible positions. He had paused. I think that's actually more accurate, he said. I think I've been thinking about the future wrong. She had written that down and thought about it for a week. She thought about it again now, at the kitchen window with her tea, looking at the amber streetlights. The future as a cloud of possible positions extending from the present state. The present state. Alive here, at the far end of something that had taken 3 years and 14 months and 6 months of negotiation to arrive at. The cloud extending from this moment, uncertain in its details, shaped by the actions taken and not yet taken, full of positions that were not yet determined, and would not be determined until someone arrived at them. She thought, we will determine them. That is what we do. We arrive at the future and we determine it, not by knowing in advance what it will be, but by being, when we get there, the thing we have been becoming. She finished her tea. She went back to bed. She slept. The Keth sent a transmission on the day before Daejung's departure for the exchange program, addressed specifically to Mara, which was unusual. The Keth's prior communications had been addressed to the human delegation collectively or to the formal role she held. This one came through the secure relay at 0800 and was addressed. Human liaison, Mara Voss, Contact Bureau founder and primary negotiator. She was not technically the Contact Bureau founder. She had not founded anything. She had assembled a network and negotiated a document, and stood in an amber corridor, and spoken imperfect phonemes at a being that could have ended the conversation much more violently. She made a note to address the designation question at the next administrative session. It was the kind of thing that mattered to get right. The transmission read, we have completed an initial review of the catalog entries for all 43 contact worlds in the consortium's record. We have found that 5 worlds in addition to Earth show anomalous data patterns in their historical records, patterns that our prior models classified as statistical noise but which we now recognize as potential indicators of a category, similar to the one you have demonstrated. We intend to re-examine those records. This process will take considerable time. We acknowledge that the outcomes of this re-examination are uncertain. We find that uncertainty, in this context, is an appropriate state. She read that last line 3 times. She wrote it in her notebook. She drew a box around it. She looked at it for a long time. We find that uncertainty, in this context, is an appropriate state. She thought about what it cost to write that. She thought about 400 years of perfect records and certainty that had never needed to audit itself, and she thought about the 11 days of deliberation and the insufficient and the 42 seconds it took to render the longest transmission in the history of contact. And she thought about the working group and the adaptation coefficient that could not be calculated, and the Keth observer in the doorway saying, "I am revising my records." And she thought about all of it as a single line of causation that had begun on a beach in a film she had watched at the age of 8 and ended here in a basement in Geneva with a creature from a civilization 400 years old telling her, in the most formal language it possessed, that it had learned to value not knowing. She thought, my father would have loved this. He was a man who loved the moments when something got bigger than the frame it started in. She wrote 5 more worlds, 5 entries to re-examine, 5 possibilities that were always present and are now being seen. She wrote, the record is always being written. We just forgot that it was always being written. The Keth forgot that it was always being written. That is the thing we have in common. In the end, not the forgetting, but the capacity to remember again. She put the notebook down. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, the ordinary ceiling of a basement in Geneva, and she thought, good, this is good. She went upstairs to help Dae-jung pack. He had very little to bring. This was not poverty, it was philosophy, which was a distinction he had articulated once over dinner in a way she had found convincing. He believed that the less you carried, the more freely you moved, and the more freely you moved, the more you could adapt, and adaptation was what mattered. He was 22 years old, and he was going to spend 6 months on a vessel designed for a species that breathed different air, ate different food, communicated in a register that required laryngeal adjustments to approximate, and held a framework for reality that was only now, very slowly, beginning to accommodate the idea that it was insufficient. He had 2 bags. Are you afraid? She asked. Very, he said. He zipped the second bag with the precise economy of movement he brought to everything, and looked at her with the expression she had seen in the engineering ring, that particular expression that lives at the intersection of fear and the decision to proceed anyway. My grandfather said something else, actually. He said the mine was dark, but it wasn't empty. He said down there, in the dark, there was always something to understand. About rock, about water, about the ways things move under pressure. He said the fear kept you honest. It kept you from getting careless about the understanding. He picked up the bags. The fear keeps you honest, she said. The fear keeps you honest, he confirmed, and he smiled at her, the smile of someone who is 22 years old and afraid and going anyway. And she thought, this is what we look like. This is the thing the Keth is now watching for in 5 more world's records. This face, this decision, this specific human quality that is not bravery but contains it, that is not recklessness but requires it, that is built from the understanding that the alternative to going is a kind of not being, that you will carry with you for the rest of your life. She walked him to the departure point. She shook his hand, which felt inadequate and was what she had. He walked to the vehicle that would take him to the launch facility. She watched until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she went back to work, because there was always more work. That was the thing no one told you about endings. They were not endings. They were the far end of something and the near end of something else. And the something else required the same quality of attention and presence and willingness to be wrong that the first thing had required. The formal agreement existed. The catalog entry had been revised. The exchange program had begun. 5 more worlds were being re-examined. These were real things, and they mattered, and she permitted herself to know that they mattered. And there was work to do. The Liaison Bureau needed staff and protocols, and a library of Keth communication research that didn't yet exist in the form it needed to exist in. There were 41 other exchange candidates preparing for departure over the next 2 years who needed orientation in Keth language, Keth culture, Keth behavioral patterns, Keth spatial logic, all the things Mara had spent 3 years learning from the outside, and which now needed to be transmitted to people who would learn them from the inside. There were 5 worlds with anomalous data patterns, and what those patterns meant and what they might require from Earth was something nobody yet knew, but it was something that would need to be thought about carefully and patiently by people who understood the weight of the word anomalous in the consortium's records. There was the question of the 3 fallow worlds, which was a question she had been carrying for 18 months, and which the formal agreement had not addressed, and which would need to be addressed eventually in a future session in the right language and with the right framework when the relationship between Earth and the consortium was strong enough to bear the weight of the question. She thought about fallow, left to lie, the potential for future use not extinguished, 3 civilizations sleeping in the dark, waiting for something that had not come yet. She wrote in her notebook, "We did not yet ask. We are not yet ready to ask well, but we will ask." She underlined it. She closed the notebook. She put it in her bag, the same battered bag she'd carried for 3 years, the same bag that had been on the floor of the observation trailer at Kazakhstan and in the engineering ring and in the basement in Geneva and in the formal session on neutral ground, and she stood up from her desk in the Liaison Bureau's first office, a set of rooms in the UN building that had been reallocated with a kind of institutional generosity that suggested the UN was not entirely sure what to make of the situation, but was committed to appearing confident about it. And she looked out the window at the November lake, which was gray and wide and moving. She thought about what Rook had said, worlds that said yes, worlds that got broken, whatever they were before the Keth showed up, maybe 1 or 2 still figuring it out, and now, one that was anomalous, one that was active study, one whose record was open, being written in both directions by both parties in a language that was still being built. She thought, that is enough to start with. She picked up her bag. She went to find Rook, who was probably at the cafe, probably at the corner table, probably looking at a newspaper and thinking specifically. She would tell him about the 5 worlds. He would be quiet for a moment, and then say something that contained the whole truth of the situation, in 12 words or fewer, which was a skill she had never developed and had come to regard as close to art. The lake was gray, the city was full of people. The sky above them was the same sky it had always been, full of things being revised and records being rewritten and old certainties that had met something they couldn't categorize and were slowly building new categories to hold it. She walked toward the cafe. She thought about waves. She thought about standing in them, the specific physics of that, the cold of it, the force of it, the way the ground shifts under your feet when the water moves across it, and the way you compensate without thinking, micro-adjustments, 1,000 tiny corrections that add up to the single outcome of remaining upright. She thought, we do not stand still in the wave. We do not resist it. We move in it continuously without stopping, making the 1,000 corrections that keep us standing, and this looks from the outside like stillness, but is the opposite of stillness. She thought, the Keth watched us from a distance and saw stillness. They are now close enough to see the corrections, she thought. Good. She reached the cafe. Through the window, she could see Rook at the corner table, the newspaper, the coffee. Sylvie behind the counter, looking up as the door opened, already reaching for the cup. Mara sat down. She was home, or close enough. She was at the near end of the next thing. She was ready. The record was open. The lake moved behind the city, the way it had always moved, and the city moved around its edges, and the people in it moved with the ordinary determined persistence of a species that had been shaped by every catastrophe the world had to offer and had learned, over millions of years of practice, to keep moving. The record was open. That was everything. That was enough.